Our scripture this morning is the Bible's response to Dickens' Christmas Carol. Just like Scrooge asked that everybody obey him and do his thing until he was actually facing death and realized the destruction he was going to face, the rich man in this story wanted to have an afterlife experience for his siblings to make them learn how to behave better so they wouldn't end up where he is. Now, that's kind of where the parallels end, of course, because the whole thing about Dickens is that you needed something shocking to tell you to change, whereas the biblical scripture we're looking at, Jesus points out, you had Moses, you had all the prophets, all the information's there, you could have followed it. And there was so much Jesus' message. Because remember, Jesus didn't come to start Christianity. We did that ourselves a couple of centuries after Jesus' death. Jesus came to get people to go back to the Hebrew scriptures, back to the tradition they had, and start to actually live it. Because if you look through all of the Hebrew scriptures, everything that Jesus talked about, it's right there. Taking care of each other, being kind to the stranger, how to be appropriate with money, how to work for peace and not war. It's all in the prophets and it's all in Moses. Jesus was just repeating that and giving a lived example, since the written example didn't seem to be enough for the people of the time. He was giving a lived example of the very same message. So we have the setup in a story that sounds like it's predictive, but it's not. And this is one of the things with apocryphal stories in the Bible. They're not predictions. They're just stories. The whole apocryphal genre really was first century sci-fi. That's what it was. We compare now to the various fantasy stories and deep space stories and star adventure stories that we have. That was the kind of thing that apocryphal stories meant to these folks. They understood there were stories, but the stories that dealt with the bigger issues, the good versus evil, the living for the benefit of others and living for selfishness. They worked all these things out through their literature, much like we did, and the apocryphal story was a big place where they talked about the metaphorical destruction of the community to come. So there is nothing in what happened to the rich man that actually designates what's going to happen to us if we don't obey. Okay, it's just story. And a lot of people want to look at this literally, and that's a total waste of energy. We have the story of a very rich man who was very content, had all the greatest things in life, was a very satisfied individual who would go out of his house in complete disdain and not even pay attention to this poor man who was sitting at the gate when he came back and forth from his house. And then we have Lazarus, this poor, decrepit, broken individual with absolutely nothing, relegated to begging so that he would be able to eat every day. Probably didn't have a place to live. Now, I just want to do an aside for a minute. This Lazarus is not the Lazarus that is Mary and Martha's brother. They had money. They had a house. Martha had such a house that she could invite Jesus to be and his entourage to come and stay. That's a different family than this Lazarus. And we have to remember, just because names are the same doesn't mean they're the same person. Because given the logical conclusion, if we think every time we see John, it's the one person, every time we see Lazarus, it's this one person, every time we see Mary, it's this one person, we'd be stuck with 12 people in the Christian scriptures? And that's just illogical and certainly not enough people to start a movement. So anyway, different Lazarus. This Lazarus in the story we have today is a poor person. And he is absolutely desperate. Can't work, doesn't have family support. He is left to beg. And then, of course, death comes, as it does to everybody. And then we have the reversal. Remember how in the Magnificat, in the very beginning of Luke, we had how the rich would be brought down and the poor would be raised up? It's not a matter of complete reversal of places, which this story, as an apocryphal story, does. But it's a leveling of the field when the Magnificat talks about it. The high brought low, the low brought up, so that they're equal. This story is not worried so much about the equality of this. They want to show that in the next existence, the next world, the next community that is created in God's name, The poor are not destitute, and the rich don't have everything that they're wanting. So we have that image of the change where the rich man is just absolutely miserable. And now he's the beggar asking Lazarus to pay attention to him. Now, Lazarus doesn't talk in any of this, so we have no idea what Lazarus' opinion is. He's just a named character there just to identify that the poor man has an identity. It's Abraham that does the talking. Abraham, who is the father of all people in the Middle East. All Christians, all Muslims, all Jews, everybody who identifies goes back. They're called the Abrahamic religions for a reason. So we have Father Abraham, and we have this image of Abraham cradling Lazarus in his arms. The actual Greek says holding Lazarus to his bosom, and that's where the African spiritual rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, that's the story. This is where it comes from. For some reason, people think the word bosom is suggestive, whatever. It's just meant to be the chest area. So we have Moses protecting Lazarus like a child, like a small child that needs to be loved and nurtured and cared for. And we have the rich man who had all the benefits in this life, lose every single one of them in the next life. And he asks for Lazarus to comfort him, something he didn't give to Lazarus. And Abraham steps in and says, no. He says, besides that, there's a divide between where you are and where we are. Even if we tried to pass over, we couldn't do it. So then the rich man thinks a little bit harder. Well, I have siblings. Can you send Lazarus to them? Because by this time the rich man has figured out he's not talking to Lazarus, he's talking to Abraham. Can you send Lazarus to them and have them be warned so they won't be here like I am? It's like the Ebenezer Scrooge moment. Here it is. And then Abraham says, look, you had all the books of Moses. That's the first 5 books of the Bible, which is known in Hebrew tradition as the laws, the Pentateuch. You had all of the prophets, so major prophets and minor prophets. You had all this option to read and learn and figure things out, and you didn't, and they didn't. And then he says, the ironic kicker, said, even if someone rose from the dead, you wouldn't recognize what is going on, which is no longer Lazarus. We're talking about Jesus. Even Jesus' resurrection wasn't enough to convince a lot of people that God was serious about this, that this is the way you are supposed to live, that it had all been written in the Hebrew scriptures and repeated now in the Christian scriptures. Everything we need to know is there. How to welcome strangers, how to live life, how to treat people properly, how to use money responsibly, how to share our resources, how to worship God above all else, how to take care of people who are on the edges of civilization. All of that is in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament it used to be called, and the Christian scriptures, the New Testament. It's all there. But even Jesus resurrected wasn't enough to get people to understand what's going on. As apocryphal stories do, they are geared to make you think. There's no nice little bow at the end of the story. There's no tidying up. We don't know anything more about Lazarus and the rich man. This is where their story, the interlude with them has come to an end. But the message is pretty clear. Like, what you've been told to do, you've been told to do again and again and again. This is not news. Look around you. Listen to the wise people in your community. It's the same message over and over and over again. And if you don't do it, then people are not going to be raised and saved and all these wonderful corporate things that are promised to us. The world is going to continue to be as destructive and disappointing and as miserable as it was previously. And no new miracle, no new teaching is going to change people. They already have everything they need. We already have everything we need. So we now have the choice. Are we going to learn from it, change our behavior, and walk in the way Christ pointed towards? Or are we going to continue on the way we have, worshiping money and status and comfort, and end up with none of that when we are in the next existence? Now, Again, the image of the burning and whatever else, that's hyperbole. That's for story purposes. That's not going to happen. But what is going to happen is that we could work ourselves out of our comforts. If we don't start sharing the bounty now, there's no guarantee we're going to continue to be comfortable. We we can look around and see the world changing. We see the economy struggling. We see wars popping up all over the place. There's no guarantee of continued comfort. But there is a guarantee of change for everyone's sake if we focus on sharing the resources that we have. Are we going to listen to those messages that scientists have been giving us and historians have been giving us and uh, uh, learned peoples, researchers, um, Nobel Prize winners, all of them giving the same message? Are we going to listen? Because the message is out there. One more voice is not going to change the fact that the message is already there. Are we going to listen? That is really the question. And each of us has to figure that out individually, but nothing is going to change unless we do it collectively.